Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Markin Powell. I'm a Japanese literary translator, and I represent the Translation Committee as a trustee on the board of PEN America, an organization whose mission it is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate the power of the written word and to champion the freedom to write. This is our 18th PEN World Voices Festival, co-founded by Esther Allen. Is she here yet? In 2005, and since then the festival has stayed true to its original mission to celebrate the power of storytelling and literature in translation and to convene global voices across borders, language, and culture. Over the last years, PEN America has tracked an alarming rise in book bans across the United States, and our Freedom to Write Index tracked the cases of over 300 writers who were detained or imprisoned around the world for their writing or for exercising their freedom of expression in 2022. Now is the time to be louder together and to defend the freedom to write, read, and speak at home and around the globe. This week we'll honor the power of literature to celebrate the stories that illuminate and interrogate what divides us and that help us imagine new futures. This year we are proud to present over 40 events featuring more than 100 writers over 4 days of celebration, dialogue, and cultural exchange. For those of you who are new to PEN America, we are a member-driven organization. We have members in every U.S. state and chapter cities across the country, from Detroit to Tulsa and from Birmingham to Miami. We welcome all of you to help bring our mission to life. Check your program for more information on how to join PEN America as a member. We thank our members and our bookstore partner, the Strand Bookstore, for helping us share our translators' wonderful work with you today. Finally, I would like to share special thanks to the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, the Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Amazon Literary Partnership for their invaluable support of our work. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce today's event. First, to give a bit of background. Founded in 1959, the PEN America Translation Committee advocates on behalf of literary translators working to foster a wider understanding of their art and offering professional resources for translators, publishers, critics, and others with an interest in international literature and ideas. Currently co-chaired by Annalise Finnegan and Frida Afari. I think we have numerous former co-chairs here with us today as well. The committee is proud to present this manifesto on translation to the literary translation community and to the public at large. I'm wondering, we get a show of hands. How many translators are in the room? It's great, it's great. How many editors? Any editors or publishers in the room? Okay, good to see. We have any readers in the room? Okay. Excellent, so we're all stakeholders. The earliest version of a manifesto was penned in 1963 and signed by Robert Payne, who would later serve as chair of the Translation Committee, as well as chair of the 1970 World of Translation Conference. That was the 50th anniversary of which was commemorated by the 2020 Translating the Future conference, hosted by Esther Allen and myself. As part of preparations for that event, a group of us from the Translation Committee and beyond began drafting an update to the 8-page pamphlet Manifesto on Translation, which was published in 1969. It took longer than expected to produce a collectively authored document that reflected what the group deemed to be an accurate accounting of the current state of translation affairs and an amply urgent and visionary call for the future of literary translation. But we hope that the 2023 Manifesto on Translation, which was published just last week, appropriately on May Day, was worth waiting for, and that it will galvanize and inspire the various stakeholders that make up the translation community to deliberate and work together toward the goals enumerated within. I forgot to check there were QR codes. I don't know if they're around. I meant to check to make sure. There was a QR code for the manifesto, but you can find it on pen.org if you'd like to follow as we go along, though I have a feeling you won't want to miss a moment of today's conversation. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the people who contributed to the manifesto, some or many of whom are here with us today. So if you don't mind standing while I read your names: Susan Bernofsky, Bonnie Chow, Jonathan Cohen, Kate Costello, Karen Emmerich, Matt Harrington, Michelle Hartman, Larissa Kaiser, Bruna Dantas Lobato, Elizabeth Lowe, Brett Maney, Marianne Newman, Adrian Perry, Allison Markin Powell, Liz Rose, Maureen Shaughnessy, Karine Taktiris, Laurel Taylor, Jeremy Chung, April Yee, and Alex Zucker. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. Now I'm utterly delighted to welcome the participants in today's roundtable discussion on the Manifesto. Jennifer Croft won a 2022 Guggenheim Fellowship for her novel The Extinction of Irina Rey, the 2020 William Saroyan International Prize for Writing for her illustrated memoir Homesick, and the 2018 International Booker Prize for her translation from Polish of Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk's Flights. In 2023, she received an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature. Alexa Frank has edited titles such as Tomi Hikomorimi's The Tatami Galaxy, which was shortlisted for the 2023 Penn Translation Prize, and Rin Usami's Idle Burning. She also translates from Japanese. Her translations of Offshore Lighting by Nazuna Saito and River's Edge by Kyoko Okazaki are forthcoming this summer. Anton Her won a Penn Translates grant for his translation of The Underground Village by Kang Kyung-e, and a Penheim grant for Bora Chung's Cursed Bunny, the latter of which was shortlisted for the 2022 International Booker Prize. His translation of Sang-Young Park's Love in the Big City was longlisted for the same prize in the same year. His translation of Kyung-Suk Shin's Violets was longlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Awards. Aaron Robertson is a writer, translator, and editor. His translation of Ijaba Shiego's novel Beyond Babylon was shortlisted for the 2020 Penn Translation Prize and National Translation Award. In 2021, he received a National Endowment for the Arts grant in translation. And our moderator for today is writer and translator Bonnie Chow. Bonnie's short story collection, All Roads Lead to Blood, was a finalist for a 2019 CLMP Firecracker Award. She has received fellowship support from Kundiman, Vermont Studio Center, Millay Colony, among others. And she's a board member of the American Literary Translators Association. So once again, thank you all for coming today, and thank you to our guests for agreeing to take part in what promises to be a marvelous event. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Very excited to see so many people interested in translation. I thought we would start with maybe just first reactions to the manifesto. It's been really thrilling to have something that a bunch of people have worked on for a few years kind of finally out in the world. And I'm curious to hear, I don't know, anything that jumped out at you that felt very urgent, surprising, resonant. Maybe we can start there. I don't know, maybe we can go down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I was really impressed by all of the, detail of the manifesto. I think my mind immediately went to what happens next. I'm really interested in thinking about literature as a kind of ecosystem. So I love that there's this thorough document that is prepared by translators for translators. And now I wonder, it isn't great that there are two editors here. So I wonder if we can talk about or think about collectively, it is great that we have two editors on the panel. How is it that we reach beyond the translation, the pre-existing translation community, obviously while wanting to also foster all of you translators who might just be kind of starting out in your careers, or anyone in the translation field. And then I think, of course, there's so much more activism to be done that is really usefully highlighted in the manifesto, and that can also be something that we brainstorm about. But yeah, reaching editors and readers, and also just benefactors who might be able to help create prizes and campaigns and other things that might make translation seem a little bit less intimidating to a US or, you know, potentially UK Anglophone audience, which also includes, you know, publishers. So that was my reaction.
Yeah, just building on what Jenny said, we were talking about this this morning, and it's really great to have this document because it really outlines issues that translators have been talking about, but people outside of the translator community may not be so aware of. The one issue, there were so many great things in it, but the one thing that stuck out to me was, for example, bridge translation. And I've had a really terrible like co-translation experience where basically I was the translator of color who did all of the work, and then this other person came in and like, you know, got co-translation credit for doing editing. And I think that like things like that where people outside of, not even editors, are even like for that project, the editor was like, I don't see why that's a problem. I don't see why this person should not get co-translation credit. And for me, I feel like if we have a document like this, it's so easy now to just point to that section and go, as you can see, this is a problem that exists in our community, and this is one of the ways in which we need to address it. So for me, that was like a really great kind of like thing to have. The other thing that I noticed about the manifesto, it's very diverse and it has a lot of different points. There's one thread that kind of runs through them for me, is that it refuses to see translators as like this passive mouthpiece, just like conveying like the source material into, like passively conveying the source material into. It basically portrays translators as very, very active artisans who insist the source on like coming halfway to meet them, and not just the translators going to the source and losing ourselves in the source and like making it sound like it was written in English or whatever. I mean, it is written in English because it's translated. So I really like those two aspects of the manifesto. One, the fact that, you know, it's kind of like a really great reference, really, really great shorthand to have, and with, you know, PEN America kind of like giving it, kind of like legitimizing it like as an institution. I mean, it's unfortunate that we need that, but we need that. And the other is this fact that it portrays translators as a very active agent in publishing and in the creation of books.
Yeah, I think for me, what really, you know, kind of stood out is how holistic the document felt. So it challenges sort of everybody to be a part of the kind of advocacy process. So translators, readers, book reviewers, you know, publishers, editors. And I think because, so I was not a part of drafting the manifesto, and so reading it, I kind of realized that it challenged me too to, you know, to think about my own sort of, you know, shortcomings and where I want to be more attentive to the issues that the manifesto raised. And in a concrete way, you know, I am a translator and also you know, editor now. And at my job, I recently acquired our first translation, and so it's exciting, and also it's kind of, it is where you know, all of the sort of theoretical, you know, advocacy work is going to be tested now. And I think that's exciting, right? It's something to hold. It will help, I think, hold myself to account. And so that, I think, is the kind of the most exciting part about the document, is that it really sort of lays out a path for us all to be better champions. Yeah. And also, the one thing I'll add is that one of the sort of emphases of the manifesto is that translation is something that should be talked about outside of a formal institution. So not only within schools and publishing houses, but how can we make this you know, this field, this practice important in everyday home spaces. How do we integrate this really rich practice into our lives? And that is something that I've just always been very personally invested in, and I'm excited to talk about that more with everybody.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming out, I guess, to start. And I'm just really, again, very honored to be a part of this panel. I feel a little bit maybe out of my depth just, with the breadth of translators that are on stage with me and out in the audience, but I'll try my best. I guess I approached the manifesto with the same rigor that I would approach like an undergraduate paper, which is a lot of rigor. I really studied this document, and I guess speaking as someone who is coming to the document with, I guess, like a diverse experience as an editor, as a translator, also as someone who has been in the MFA system, someone who has taught, it made me think a lot about the ways I consider translation in my daily practice as a translator, as an editor of translations, as someone who has attempted to teach translations to undergraduates, and just as a reader, someone who would like to feel more a part of the translation community. I guess I speak as a manga translator, maybe, or not maybe, but I am. But as a manga translator, manga translation is not really considered literary. So I did also kind of approach this manifesto thinking, well, this doesn't always apply to me, but I'd like to maybe unpack that, because I think we could hold more space for, I think literature and translation, and it's something that I often deal with at my day job, which is as an editor of translation. It's often thought of as a very high-minded form of literature. But as we know, every culture around the world has their own literary culture, and the scale from lowbrow to highbrow is full of multitudes. It's truly a land of contrast. So I think, I guess maybe jumping off back to Jennifer's point, I am a little disappointed that the editor turnout was not as great, but that's okay, to be expected. I think one thing that I would love to talk about on this panel is how we in positions, especially those of us who might work at a big five house, even little presses, I think we all can do better, and I think a lot of people are walking the walk, doing the work, but I am constantly sort of in a push and pull of like, how do I be a better ally to translators whose work I understand and I so admire, and also realize that I cannot move mountains. I do work in a corporate space. So yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe we can kind of just start there with the publishing editorial side. I guess I'm thinking as editors who are also translators, like, I think the idea, I don't know, like, is it expected that there are only 2 editors in the crowd? It's like, I feel like in the drafting of it, we really wanted to think about the document as like we're not trying to call out, publishers, but kind of just.
We are.
Okay, we are, but with the idea that some of our goals might be different, but that where the overlap is how we can kind of build translation into something bigger and better. So how, I guess, for the 2 of you who are kind of like editor translators, how do you reconcile those like different perspectives? Like, is there a way where shifting what you're doing as an editor can be also kind of uplifting, kind of both ends?
Last chance. No, that's a great question. Thank you. I think, it's a good question also because I feel like it's just something I constantly think about and don't have the answer to. But I can speak, I guess, again, as a manga translator, relationship between an editor and translator is quite different, I think, than a literary translator and a editor, in that I don't really have a relationship with the editor that I'm working with usually. I am more of like a hired gun. So it is very workmanlike, and actually the manifesto was interesting to me because the way it defined bridge translation, it actually kind of made me think a lot about manga translation, because we are told to err on the literal side. Our own expertise as writers is not really trusted. And to me, as someone who, not to toot my own horn, but I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, so I'm like, well, that MFA is going in garbage. But so I just feel like, as an editor, my approach to translators is that I see them as a collaborator. I can read Japanese and I can read some Spanish, but not enough. But either way, even if I didn't read those languages, I feel like I treat them as the author of that text. They are my lifeline. I ask them questions. They are the person that I'm constantly emailing with. We have talked a little bit on the social media space about just the toll on mental health that publishing can take on authors and translators. This is something I think about. Thank you, guys. All right. Work here is done. But no, it's something that I think about a lot in my own editing practice, because, like, as a translator, man, it takes a toll on my mental health. I'm constantly kind of like squirreling to get through these 3-week deadlines, and then also dealing with a 9 to 5, well, not even 9 to 5, a 9 to whenever I feel done kind of job. So I want to, be an ally to translators. I know, again, I work at HarperCollins in a very corporate house, very corporate setting. Sometimes that allyship, there are barriers just by the modes in which we work. But it's something that, as someone who went to Bard as a liberal arts graduate, I'm also like, well, how can I negotiate those systems and do justice to who I'm working with? It's a pretty, hard it's a hard balancing act, but I'm trying to do it as best I can, and I'll continue to try.
Yeah, great response. So I work at Spiegel and Grau, which is an independent publisher now, and that's interesting because this company was established in 2021, and so we're trying a lot of new things now. And I came into the industry through the world of translation, really, and as a kind of advocate on behalf of translators. And so I think, there are challenges, of course, but as a person who has their hands in both communities, like some of the advantages of the translation background is that, well, one, I just invite a lot of, I get a lot of submissions that are works in translation. I'm always in touch with, with scouts and foreign publishers who I just like talking to, right? And so that's a way to keep, like different kinds of literature on my radar. I also think that pursuing, publishing like fellowships abroad, like, is a concrete way to have those kinds of cultural exchanges that I can then, hopefully bring back to the publishing space. And so this translation that I acquired, like, for the company, is partly a result of me going to this, a fair in Italy, and speaking with publishers there. So that kind of that sort of international, like, dialogue is something that I really value, and I think in a smaller publisher, it's been easier to have those conversations. But also, now that we have acquired this project, like, my challenge is to advocate now on behalf of the translator, and that is having conversations with my bosses who understand my background, you know, and know that I probably am going to say, you know, we should pay the translator more than we're probably comfortable with as a smaller house. So all of this is like, you know, to be determined. Really, it's very live. But I think, yeah, like this is kind of, you know, like this is the process of trying to make change. I think is like for the past, you know, 2 or 3 years, these issues have mostly been sort of theoretical for me personally, and now now's a chance to actually, you know, actualize that. And the hope is that that this is the beginning of, you know, of like a robust program within this independent house, right? And I want people to see that we are welcome. That we are welcoming of works in translation. So yeah, we'll see how it pans out, but that's the hope.
In thinking through these issues of kind of equity and advocacy, I think the manifesto is predicated on the idea or on the understanding that translation is a political act. And I think maybe in my very small bubble of like translation, I'm like, yes, everyone agrees and acknowledges this, but it's actually not. I mean, there isn't a full consensus on translation as political, and I wonder if you might talk about what your views are on that, like how you, if you understand it as so, how you came to that understanding, and maybe how you might see the opposing perspective.
I mean, I subscribe to that view, and I always have. I mean, I think that it was Aaron who used the word champions. I feel like we're actually talking about so many different things also already. So we're talking about, on the one hand, like the promotion of they're trying to get people to recognize that literature written in English is not in any way preferable to literature written in all the other languages of the world. And then like how to negotiate that with publishers, which may be in the language of commerce. Like how can we make it so that, you know, I tried to get Olga Tokarczuk's Flights published for 10 years, and everyone said that book would never sell, but then it obviously became a huge bestseller. Like, how can we kind of convey that possibility, and how can we also make that, ensure that that happens, at least like in some cases? So there's that whole side of just like, how do we bring attention to writers who are not writing in English, who are from other countries. And then there's the question of like translator equity and what do translators need and how can we recognize the work of translators. I mean, all of that is obviously political, and you know, we're also the manifesto says that translation needs to be viewed as a specialized kind of writing. So let's also think about like, would writers in the US say that writing is a political act? It really, really depends. A lot of people would, I certainly would, but a lot of people maybe are too complacent in their position in society to view it that way, and I think that's really what it comes down to. So if you are very, very comfortable as a translator for some reason that I can't imagine, then maybe you wouldn't think that it's a political act, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, so to me, it's such an intrinsically political act. Just choosing which book you're going to translate in itself is a huge political act. And to me, like the other position, I know I should be agnostic, but it's just totally absurd. And like Jenny says, choosing to not be political is a very political act, and it means that you are totally fine with the way things are. And to me, this came ahead during the Amanda Gorman translation controversy, where the translator, the Dutch translator, I believe, like they stepped down in solidarity with translators of color, with particularly Black translators, and it was an act of solidarity. And then this was interpreted as, oh, this translator was canceled for being white. And so while that controversy raged on, I said on Twitter, hey, it would be nice, if as translators, we kind of thought about the choices that we make as translators. And then all of a sudden, I got all these mentions going like, how dare you say that I can't translate because I'm white? And so I thought, you know what, that's a really great idea. Why don't you stop translating because you're white? And I wrote this story called The Great White Canceling, where all white translators are canceled. It's on Words Without Borders. And when I wrote it, and I read it to my husband, it's very short. I read it to my husband, he said, your career will be over if you publish this. And another translator of color also said, yeah, you probably shouldn't publish that. But because they were both worried for me, they were like, people are not going to read your work as ironic. They're going to think that you actually think this. And I thought, good. And so Words Without Borders very brilliantly put this little epigraph where it says Anton Hur takes a wry look at translation as a political act or something. So for me, it's always been extremely political. And I always felt like my existence as a translator of color is extremely political. Last year, I was the only shortlisted, a Booker Prize shortlisted translator who was a translator of color. Interestingly enough, this year, there's only one translator of color who is shortlisted as well, and she's also Korean. And so to me, it's since this is a work that I've been doing for over 20 years, even though literary translation is quite I've only been doing it since 2016. I've been doing it for over 20 years, where I'm I was born as a translator. I've worked as a translator all my life. So for me, it's but here, for some reason, in the literary translation sphere, my presence in itself becomes political. And I've noticed so many times where if I say something or I translate something, white translators, especially in my language combination of Korean, which is an Asian language, it's taken completely differently. And it's given completely different credence. It's like I'm delegitimatized just because, I'm not white. And this has happened so many times, I can't even, I was about to say something and give you an example of that. But there are just so many examples. So I feel to tell me that translation isn't political, and that's another example of thinking of translators as these passive mouthpieces. And I'm well, then an AI is going to come for your job, and no one's going to be there to argue for your case. And I'm happy about that, because then you'll be part of the great white canceling, which I advocate.
Yeah, this is a great question. And for me, it started so there are many ways to answer it. For me, it started as more of a kind of abstract concern, in that in college, I majored in Italian and I minored in African American studies, and I was curious about where those two fields overlapped. I didn't have a goal. I didn't plan to be a translator. I didn't know where I was going exactly. But one question that I would always get is, why those two? Why those together? Which I always thought was fascinating, because it implied there's something abnormal about this. There's some pairing here that is interesting because it's a little exotic. It's a little strange, and I took that kind of as a challenge, to find the kinds of stories that are not very commonly told, and that kind of question led to me learning about the presence of African American GIs who would appear in these Italian post-war films, you know, neorealist movies. And I'm like, this is incredible, right? Like there is this overlap that that is just not really well known. And it was those kind of historical questions that led me to focus mostly on the works of Italian writers who are addressing, so mostly Black Italian writers who are addressing the relationship between North Africa and the Horn of Africa and Italy during the colonial period. And so both uncovering those, well, not uncovering, but translating those stories is kind of like an overtly political act. Only really translating those stories is an act. And it's also meant to encourage people kind of to stop asking why African American studies and why Italian. It should be kind of obvious, because that historical encounter between the Horn of Africa, North Africa, and Italy is also how we understand concretely the roots of fascism. And so this very niche topic is actually, it's speaking to global concerns. I mean, yeah. I could go on, sorry, but like it's. I
wish you would.
Yeah, it's so and that's why I think translation is, of course, in part it's about the actual text, but it's so much about an orientation towards life, towards how you view history, how you think of the idea of canons, like what is canonical. Why is it canonical? And translation itself is, there's so much potential there to like change what we think of as the canon, as conventional. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I guess I also think about Blackness in translation a lot because there's honestly not that many of us out there. Or from what I perceive, there's not that many of us out there. And, one thing about the manifesto, I think the coalition is very diverse. There's probably diversity that is invisible, I can't account for, but I think I only saw one Black person as a drafter of the manifesto, and I feel like what motivates me partly is that, my name is Alexa Frank, and I translate Japanese. A lot of people, they have a lot of problems processing that for many reasons. So one thing I want to do is challenge, what translation looks like, because for a long time, I had only really known the names of white translators, and they did amazing work, inspiring work, but I think, and speaking specifically as a Black person, Black people's facility for language has always been challenged. And unlike Asian and Latino translators too, we often aren't assumed to lay claim to another language. So it's basically like we aren't masters of English and we don't really have these ancestral ties to another language. What can you really do? And, that I am not a master at Japanese. I'm often thinking like, what does this mean? But it's something that, I continue to study. I'm really passionate about. And I also feel I have a pretty good mastery of English at this point of my life. I wish, and this also extends, I guess, to, as an editor as well. Young women editors are often kind of questioned, their expertise is questioned, and if you add the people of color element, it's like, what are you doing here? So in publishing houses too, we have had more hiring of people of color. I think there's a lot of work to be done in retention, making them feel like they have earned their spot, that they know what they're doing. So I guess going back to me as a translator, so I'm interested, I think, in doing translation and being more of a visible component of it, just so that, I think just, again, we talk about this so much, but just having someone out there who might look even a little bit like you can really do a lot. It makes you think, okay, well, I can do this too. I mean, they've done it. You know, there's all these doors that I think we need to just work harder to hold open. So when I see a Black translator, I do feel like, man, I really just want to work with this person. And it's a selfish reason. It's just because I want more people to know who they are.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, sort of seeing yourself reflected in the industry is such a, I mean, it has a tangible impact, and like people, younger translators of color have reached out, to me and have just asked about like, what is this field? How can I enter it? What are the barriers to entry? And on the one hand, like the manifesto speaks to this really interesting point, which is like, underrepresented translators should not bear the entire burden of, of being like the spokesperson, et cetera, which is very true. And also the other, side of that is, unfortunately, that work is often the only thing that, like, it becomes necessary because no one else is doing it really. And if you can try to be like some kind of imperfect beacon or model for someone else, then I think it can be worthwhile. So it's a complicated thing to navigate, but it definitely is, I think, worthwhile at times.
Thinking about the visibility of the translator, of translation labor, what do you all think about, and I'm thinking right now about in one of the sections of the manifesto on teaching or academia, it says teaching translations as translations. And I think kind of throughout the document, there's a lot of this, or how do we read translations as translations? What does that mean to you? Is that an imperative, an ideal? How do we do that?
I would say, but I am not a teacher. I think there are teachers here who...
Yeah, so there are like Jennifer Croft is one. There are several here in this audience who, like, I don't care who you translate, I'm gonna buy the book because you did it. And I know that, like, if Jeffrey Zuckerman translates a book, I'm like, oh yeah, that must be an interesting book. So I'm gonna buy it because your name is on it and you're attached to it. So for me, I'm definitely like, but to me that's not unusual because I'll buy a CD because Hilary Hahn is playing this concerto that I've heard several million versions of, but it's Hilary Hahn, so I'm gonna buy it. So to me, it's not something unnatural at all to read something as a translation. I read for Korean translations all the time, even though I can read them in the original Korean, because I'm just so interested in how did Seo-jae pull this off? Like, how did Victoria Cottle pull this off? How did Sophie Bowman pull this off? Like, I'm so interested in how they would do something that, and that's because I'm interested in the translators and their previous works, and so I know how they might do it, but do they do it that way? Like, it's just interesting, It's like, and again, it's like, listening to a pianist that you really like, or, an orchestra that you follow, or so. And that kind of brings you to this idea of the translator as, again, not a passive mouthpiece, but an interpreter as well, and someone who's doing an interpretation of something, an artist, an artisan. And so this is one of those things where I feel everyone in translation knows, but the outside world maybe not so much.
Yeah, I just would say very briefly that I have encountered some resistance to teaching translations at universities because of this kind of somehow lingering idea that translations are necessarily unfaithful and that we're doing some kind of harm or violence to the original by reading a translation. So I think the more we can maybe, one of my ideas behind the whole translators on the cover thing is also this question of representation and identity. If you don't know the identity of the translator, you can't really begin to have this conversation about who is translating whom, why, what kind of collaboration do they have, etc. But if you are looking at that and you're reading a book and also talking about the way that it's written, which should surely be done in any class, then you have to be talking about the translator and the translation, and also hopefully contextualizing, where the book came from, etc. But it goes back to this question of collaboration and the literary ecosystem as one in which no one is thriving unless everyone is thriving, essentially. So everyone has to be working together.
Going back to what you said at the very beginning, what happens next? And maybe more specifically, do we have ideas for maybe people who aren't translators, maybe just general readers of translation? What are concrete steps people can take, or people who work in bookstores? What are the, conversations that we can be having, or the questions we can be asking kind of out? What are small, everyday actions that can maybe help our cause?
So I think there's so many ways that you could go about that. As an editor, like one thing that I'm interested in is like building relationships with booksellers, with Salesforce people, just to sort of to really like sell to them the idea of translation as something that is worthy of evaluation, like on its own merits, etc. Kind of being the person that explains the historical and cultural context, like, of a given work, right, to help them do their jobs more effectively too. Like, one thing that I am personally just very, very interested in is encouraging the love of translation at a young age, right? So before you get to college and begin studying a language like I did, it would, like, what does it mean to encourage love of languages in middle school maybe, or elementary school even? How do you sort of, like, just in the way that you might have a fun, creative, writing assignment for young kids, like write a poem about, I don't know, a garden or something. If you're at a school that does have language classes, as teachers, like, what does it look like to encourage your kids to play around with translation, And the goal is not necessarily to encourage, to like have a production line, where you're like producing like small literary translators, but it's just to encourage, an appreciation for other cultures, for other, literary contexts that one day will, like, I think probably help make you a better, well-rounded person, maybe. That's kind of the utopian ideal there, but yeah.
I think to that end, I'm also interested, I guess, like in the idea of discovering translation at any age, because when I edit, I often think, okay, this could be like the first book in translation that this reader has ever read, and so let's make it really good, make it really clear, etc., the best book ever, so that this will just be the gateway for them discovering more. So I guess like one little anecdote I have is that it's never too late. So my dad, who is in the audience today, he, as much manga as he bought for my sister and I throughout our lives, he had never read any of them. You know, he was appreciative but distant. So, which is, I think is correct. It was the correct method. But he's in his 60s now, and I had translated something. It was a memoir about a daughter and her relationship with her father, who happened to be an alcoholic. He's not an alcoholic, but I thought the relationship aspect would resonate with him. So he bought the book, and he read the whole thing. He started poorly, because in manga, you know, you have to read you go the opposite way. So if you know manga, there's a stop sign saying stop, you're going the wrong way, literally. So at first, when he started reading, he was like, this is really abstract. But then at a certain point, he turned around and was like, oh, wait. But he turned around. That's the important part. And he read the whole thing, and he enjoyed it. And again, he's like 60-something years old. It's really never too late. And I think just if we can just kind of convince our brains to be a little less solid, honestly, and just open ourselves up to different cultures, different discourses, just the fact that, you know, literature and translation, it's culling all these different storytelling styles that in our Western imagination, we often think they're not doing it correctly, they're not doing it right. But the thing is, they're just doing it the way they know it. It's not about right or wrong. That's such a, you know, boring way to read literature in the first place. So I would just encourage anyone, this is not the right audience to like encourage people to get interested in translation, but it's like, if you know someone who's like because I also read the New York Times comments, so I know that a lot of people have misconceptions about translation. They don't trust it, but just, you know, talk to your mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, just give them a book that you really like that's been translated. I think it will do wonders.
I think that's really great advice. And I think like a really useful thing is to do what I do, is become fans of translators. And that's something that the readership can do. And so like just if you ever read a translation that you really like, let's say you read like an Arunava Sinha translation, then you're like, wow, this was a really great translation. Don't just look at the author and read everything the author wrote. Look at the translator and look at everything they translated. Like Arunava Sinha is a really great example, because he translates like all sorts of writers and all sorts of books. He's very prolific, so you have like a whole like new vista open for you, and you'll probably like all of those books because you like that book. And that's really useful. Like there are certain publishers, like for example, Harper Via is a really good one, where they publish a lot of translations, a lot of edgy, quirky ones. So if you, for example, like Walking Practice, then you'll probably like Tatami Galaxy. And so that's also a very useful heuristic to have as a reader. And so I always encourage readers to like, you know, it doesn't have to be me, it doesn't have to be whoever, but like have maybe a set of translators, like you would have a set of writers whose works that you would pick up just because you saw their name. I think that's a really handy way for you to discover a lot of great reading, because we as translators, and you know Harper Via obviously as well, like publishers like Harper Via, like we do a lot of discovery work where we read so much source material in order to choose like what we want to translate and work on, that it like enters a kind of like it has a filter effect where we've already done a lot of legwork for you. Like we've already read a lot of duds for you so that you don't have to. And the fact that we decided that this book is one that I'm going to invest like years of my life into, that means that's like a stamp of quality for me. So yeah, read translations and become fans of translations and translators.
Yeah, and just one other point. One part of the manifesto I loved was conversation about the relationship between translation and academia. And the ways that translations are or are not, you know, valued in that space. And I'm no longer, you know, in, you know, the academic space, it gave me a lot, but I also was like so done with it. But one thing that really changed my life actually is that when I was a senior in college, you know, we normally had to write, you know, research papers as our thesis, but my advisor in my Italian department allowed me to do a creative project, which was a translation with like a small research component, like which is exactly what I wanted, you know, and that kind of openness to translation as a valid, you know, whatever academic exercise can be valuable in ways that are hard to predict sometimes. And so just, you know, if there are professors here who like, I mean, if we can make the academic space a little more receptive to translation, I mean, it would make a world of difference, I think.
Okay, I think we're gonna move to audience questions now. I think there will be a microphone available. Anyone?
Thank you so much. I'm DP Snyder, and I'm delighted to see all of you and just so grateful for this document. I have a two-parter that I want to throw out. One is that we have this document now, which is like a community in a way. It's a group voice. It's a choral voice, and I want you to know that I walked it into a meeting with a publisher this week. And I said, I'd really like you to publish this novel, my translation of this novel. Here is this manifesto. This represents me. I'd like to know what you think. So I really challenge those of us who are querying and working with publishers to show them this document. And if you do subscribe to it, tell them so. You know, make this conversation out loud. That's kind of a statement, but it's important, I think. The second thing is I'm curious, knowing how there's a great imbalance out in the world of translators translating from English, you know, in a lot of other countries, and they suffer the same things we do, if not worse. So I'm curious if this manifesto is going to be translated into other languages, and if we're going to make an effort as PEN to promote it elsewhere. Thank you.
I think as a group, we were talking about wanting it to be translated into other languages, but we've also added, at the very bottom, there's a Creative Commons license, which allows for it to be reproduced, adapted, changed into any form. And I think, I feel like, okay.
Yeah, the document is going to be pushed out to PEN International. Sorry. The document is being shared with PEN International and chapters around the world. Rather than sort of assign it to be translated, we're inviting the other PENs to adapt it, localize it, translate it for their own means. Yeah.
I think there was a question in the back.
PEN Korea is weird, though. I just want to put that out there.
First of all, I just want to thank you all. This conversation has been really, really illuminating for me. I am a university professor. I teach at NYU with the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music, and I wanted anyone on that stage who might be interested in working with us on lyric translation, because our emphasis, of course, is on recorded music, and there are several areas of recorded music where we're not able to teach as effectively about those styles as we would like to, simply because there's not a lot of translated lyrics of reggaeton, there's not a lot of translated lyrics of cantopop or or K-pop, where we could actually do the kind of in-depth teaching that we like to do on these different genres. So though anyone who is interested in translating lyrics and maybe working with some of us at Clive Davis should talk to me, because there might be some money available for the early translations, and whether you guys get a publisher to put it in book form, that's up to you.
So there is a translator sitting right there named Sojay. They're a poetry student at the New School MFA. Can you talk? Yeah.
Wait, that is so wonderful. And this also reminds me of one sort of fascinating way that translation can work in these sort of cross genre context. So the author, one of the authors I work with, her name is Ijeaba Shego, and she's Italian, but she's also beloved in Brazil. And I had translated her memoir, which is not published actually, but this like opera singer from Brazil contacted me because she was writing an opera based on Ijeaba's memoir and wanted like the English translation of it. And so I provided that to her, and she produced a piece that was based on that translation. And so there are just so many ways that that a work can manifest in the world in these really sort of fascinating ways. So your question or just reminded me of that, the potential of conversations between literature and music.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you, guys. I can't help but cite the first line of the original Manifesto on Translation, which is one of my favorite lines ever written about translation. It begins, "Translators are the lost children in the enchanted forest of literature." And I certainly don't want to stop being a lost child in an enchanted forest. Hopefully the fairy tale ends well. And I do think that original manifesto, as problematic as we read it now, did a lot of things, set down a lot of things. And so my question for all of you is, what would your most utopian, wild-eyed, crazy vision of what this manifesto could achieve, and what the translation world would look like if it did achieve that? What would that be? Like, what would be the wildest, best-case scenario?
So I want to stop writing emails. 30% of my work is actual translation, and 70% of it is writing emails and solving problems where I'm like, A, I'm not being paid for this time, and B, I'm the only person who can do it because I'm the only person who understands both sides and can speak both languages. And that's why I'm so confident that an AI will never replace me, because an AI can't solve. They can maybe do the 30%. They're getting better. They're not great, but they're getting better. But they will never be able to do the 70%. That part, I know Microsoft has the software that writes emails for you now, but I don't and I really want it to succeed because I want to stop doing it. But yeah, it's my ideal kind of world for a translator is a world where I can just translate, where I don't have to be this kind of dime store literary agent, dime store problem solver. I'm not designed for these roles. I just want to do the work that I was hired for and do translation and, sit in a cafe and be, translating. That's what I want to do. That's my ideal world. I don't want to have to scream at people on the phone, why do I have to do that? That's very exhausting for me. It's a very modest dream, but it's actually it is a very grand dream, once you break it down.
Yeah, the kind of modest dreams are, honestly, can be the most, ambitious ones, too. I think for me, it would, it would be great for publishers especially to know exactly where to go when looking for 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 translators of color. Like I field a lot of requests, like, do you know somebody? I'm like, you should look, because like I have ideas, but all it took was like a little time on Google. So having my utopian sort of vision is that publishers in particular develop more of a will to do things on their own.
I was just gonna imagine a dictatorship run by me, so my ideas are less modest. But I mean, Esther asked us for our utopian suggestions. So what if like every writer in the U.S. were required to publish a translation before publishing their own stupid book? Like, can we not focus on the idea of recycling rather than like everyone has to come up with their own brilliant, agonizing struggle that they, bring out and it's totally original. Like, let's just get rid of the idea of the original completely, break down the boundaries. I know some people feel really strongly about translation being seen as a separate thing from writing. I feel like we just need to kind of mostly erase that line. Also, let's get rid of the Nobel Prize. It's totally useless. It's misleading. Let's come up with something better, and really, focus on languages that are underrepresented in English translation. Those are the three that I do on my dictatorship.
Now that your author won a Nobel Prize, you want to get rid of it.
Correct.
Let's wait until Kyung-Suk Shin wins a Nobel Prize, and then that's a really great point. I just wanted to build on. I mean, we all love MFA programs, and I think they're great. But a really great way to learn about writing and to become a better writer is to translate. And you also get paid for it. You get paid for it. You get paid for it. So I just wanted to encourage more of that. Like, if you're someone interested in writing and you want to be a writer, and like, it's a really great apprenticeship system. Like, it helps you understand the publishing ecosystem also, and like how books are produced. My novel just got sold, and then like my editor keeps, thank you. And my editor keeps like, explaining like, and trying to like being very careful about like, can we, I know like the schedule seems whatever. I'm like, no, this is, I understand everything that's going on here. We're good, yeah. So it's been very useful for me like to have had, to have a translation career for writing. So I think, I totally encourage that, definitely. Consider as an apprenticeship, and I mean, it's as good as getting an MFA, I feel.
We have time for, I think, a couple more questions.
So my name's Dennis. I'm a graduate student, so I approach all of the translation issue very academically, of course. And the one thing that I thought, and I wanted to know if this is empowering for you, would be the translator's preface. I'm thinking of Spivak's preface to the Grammatology, which I think is in itself an amazing document, like just about Derrida, and you learn so much about the work that she had to do in giving us a translation of this crazy philosophical treatise. And sometimes when I read these translators' prefaces, notes, or however you want to call them, they're very modest documents. They're very like, just a paragraph about this one word that was very, just this one, like that's the only thing that bothered me when I did this translation, was how to translate this particular, and I'm wondering, is this sort of some of the ways in which perhaps translation can be more empowered through like having longer prefaces, longer explanations of what's going on, or if this is me just being too academic in the way I approach the great work that you do?
So at Harper Via, where I work, we always give the option to the translator to do a translator's note in the back matter of the book, and it's optional too, because I think we also realize like that is extra time. It is often unpaid time, and it's really just for, the reader's enrichment. And if the translator at the end of the day maybe would like to unpack things for their own writing, I think translators' notes are always really helpful. I love reading them because I feel like after I read a translation, I want to understand their choices. Like I want to kind of get inside their head. So I would love for translators to have more opportunities to explain themselves if they feel like explaining themselves too. Because I think some translators, especially translators of color, are often asked to explain themselves maybe a little bit too much. So we should find like the right balance.
I think like I love reading them. I hate writing them. But I'm very willing to do it if a publisher asks me for those reasons. I remember for Love in the Big City by Sang-Young Park, which is published here in America by Grove. But it was my UK publisher, Tilted Access, who asked me to write a translator's note. And I was like, oh, what do I say? Like, do I talk about adverbs? Like, I hate doing that kind of thing. So I talked about like going to gay clubs in Seoul. And that's what my translator's note is about. And like everyone loved it, and like LitHub published it, and then my American publisher decided to, they didn't have it for their first edition, but that they put it into the paperback. And so I was like, oh, maybe you can have a little fun with it, You don't have to talk about like, this line was so difficult to translate because of all of these things, which are great. I love looking at those. But really, they are, I'm trying to think of a translator's note that I really liked. There's this book called Every Fire You Tend by Sema, I'm going to ruin her, Kaigusus? Yeah. Kaigus, yeah. Translated by Nicholas Glastonbury. And Nick's translator's note is like, I teach it in class because he talks about translating trauma. And as a Korean, we have a lot of trauma in our literature. And like he hits on all of the issues so perfectly in that translator's note. I'm like, this needs to be taught. And I'm so glad that he wrote it. So I love reading them, but writing them is a little, yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to bring up quickly also that we talked about this a lot. Anton and I co-edited a recent translation portfolio in the Kenyan Review along with Jeremy Tiang. And they kept asking us, we kept having this weird non-conversation about whether or not the translations were going to be prefaced by something, because our idea was to get experimental translations. So I guess their idea was like, explain the experiment. And we went back and forth on it a lot, and I think our instinct was to let the translations speak for themselves. Like, in some ways, I don't know what good it does the reader to have the piece explained to them. Like either it succeeds or it doesn't, and it's sort of up to the reader at that point to make that decision. So I think in the same way that not every writer would want, most writers would not want to have a preface to their novel or whatever. I think sometimes it really makes sense and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes these pieces work better as independent pieces on LitHub or wherever, to be taught in class or to be enjoyed by readers, but maybe like away from the book itself. It really just depends, I think.
For the record, we love Kenyan Review. We love everybody.
Agreed.
I think I don't actually have a question. It's comments. Because I translate from Catalan, a minoritized language, I don't mind the advocacy part of the work. I feel it's actually part of my job as a translator. Because there is no context for Catalan literature and to be honest, except for French and German, there's probably no context for any of our literatures. So. And when I did a translation last year, and I did a translator's epilogue for the first time. And in fact, what I discovered was that what we bring to an epilogue is having been inside the author's head.
in this other language. And I think there's a way we can channel some of that for the reading public. And if it's an epilogue, they don't have to read it if they don't want to. You know, the translation has spoken for itself, but I'm a little bit in favor, I think. Now, I wasn't before. And the second thing is I would like to suggest to language teachers that language used to be taught through translation. And at a certain point, we happily began to treat it as a spoken, you know, we teach the spoken language, we teach people to speak, and through speech. But I think we need to get back to including translation at a certain stage in the language learning process, just so, because it is one of the best ways to learn the language. And anyway, for all the teachers here, it's an essential part of learning the language.
Okay, I think I've been given the signal that we are at an end, but thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Can we get another round of applause for our panelists?
Yes, I'm going to echo Bonnie. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to all of our participants for a really wonderful, fascinating conversation that I know will continue through the rest of the festival. The festival isn't over, so visit penn.org/festival to buy tickets. There are a lot of free events that are going on right around here, including right out on the sidewalk and in the park. Be sure to follow Penn at Penn World Voices and share your festival experience on social media if you choose to. Thank you again.